"Stop talking." The words ripped through the chamber like a thunderclap, Pam Bondi's voice shaking the air with raw fury. Every head in the room turned, every conversation cut short, as though someone had slammed their fist down on the pause button of time itself. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was suffocation. Eyes darted between the two women, some wide with shock, others narrowed with unease, the kind of tension that makes even breathing feel dangerous. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She sat still, steady, her eyes locked forward as though she had rehearsed her entire life for this exact moment. Bondi, red with indignation, leaned forward like a prosecutor trying to break a witness, her voice a weapon sharpened not by reason, but by sheer volume. The chamber was no stranger to heated words. But this was different. This was a moment when power tried to silence truth, when arrogance mistook shouting for strength. And in that instant, the entire atmosphere shifted. Even the cameras, unblinking and merciless, seemed to hold tighter on the two figures as though they, too, knew history was unfolding. Gasps rippled across the crowd. A few nervous chuckles scattered in the air, the kind of laughter that isn't born from humor but from disbelief. What had started as a heated exchange had just tipped over into something else, a raw, unfiltered clash that would ignite the public square. And yet, in the middle of it all, Crockett's calm presence radiated like a counterweight. She didn't match the yelling. She didn't rise to the bait. She didn't let the storm define her. Instead, her stillness became its own kind of defiance, a quiet strength that said more than any raised voice could. Millions didn't yet know they were witnessing the spark of a viral firestorm. Within hours, this moment would leap across phones and screens, headlines and hashtags, transforming into something far larger than a single exchange between two women. It would become a cultural litmus test: noise against clarity, arrogance against composure, fury against grace. But no one could have predicted how Jasmine Crockett's calm reply would change everything. To understand why this clash struck a nerve across America, you have to look beyond the shouting itself. This wasn't just another heated back-and-forth on Capitol Hill. It was the convergence of two radically different worlds, two philosophies about justice, power, and who gets to speak for the American people. Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, carried with her a reputation forged in the fires of partisan battles. To her supporters, she was a warrior, a relentless fighter willing to shout down opponents in the name of her cause. To critics, she was a symbol of everything wrong with political theater: loud, combative, more invested in performance than principle. She had built her career on taking up oxygen in the room, talking over, talking louder, talking longer. And that night, she expected to do exactly the same. But across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a rising star who represented something profoundly different. A congresswoman and lawyer, Crockett had never built her name on volume. Instead, she had built it on resilience, on an unshakable calm that disarmed even the fiercest critics. Where Bondi's energy erupted like firecrackers, loud, bright, and fleeting, Crockett's presence was steady like bedrock. She didn't shout to be heard. She spoke so clearly that silence followed her. The debate itself carried stakes that stretched far beyond the walls of the chamber. At its heart were questions of justice and fairness, questions about who holds power and how it should be exercised. For many Americans watching, these weren't abstract legal issues. They were personal. They were about identity, immigrants searching for dignity, families demanding fairness, citizens longing for leaders who reflected their struggles rather than exploited them. In this atmosphere, every gesture mattered, every word carried weight. Bondi's interruptions weren't just interruptions. They were echoes of a deeper cultural divide, where some voices were told they didn't belong, where some Americans were ordered to stop talking simply because they dared to speak truth to power. And in that chamber, when those words erupted, the divide became visible to everyone. Crockett's reputation preceded her: sharp, composed, unafraid of confrontation but never consumed by it. For communities too often silenced, she became a vessel of validation. Her strength wasn't theatrical, it was principled. And that contrast with Bondi couldn't have been starker. Viewers watching live could feel it, even if they couldn't yet articulate it. This wasn't just a spat between two politicians. It was the embodiment of a larger battle playing out across America, between those who cling to volume as proof of power and those who wield composure as proof of truth. Bondi leaned forward with the force of a woman who had always expected to dominate the room. Crockett leaned back, steady, prepared, her silence carrying its own form of authority. It wasn't just about winning the night. It was about defining what leadership itself should look like. And as the tension grew, it became clear. One voice would define the night. Pam Bondi did not arrive in that chamber as an unknown figure. For years, she had cultivated a reputation as a fixture of America's legal and political battlefield, a woman who wielded her title as Florida's Attorney General like a badge of both authority and defiance. In the heat of national controversies, Bondi was there, smiling for cameras, sparring with critics, her voice sharpened into sound bites designed for cable news. Her rise had been marked by high-profile legal battles that vaulted her into the spotlight. She stood before microphones with the confidence of someone who had mastered the art of turning law into theater. Bondi relished confrontation. She didn't shy away from conflict. She invited it. On the evening news, her tone was crisp, rehearsed, delivered with the conviction of someone who believed her role was to speak louder, hit harder, and leave no space for the opposition to breathe. To her allies, she was a relentless fighter who carried their cause with fire. To her critics, she was a grandstanding partisan who blurred the line between justice and spectacle, and both images, in their own way, were true. Bondi understood better than most that in the age of 24-hour news cycles, power wasn't just about the law, it was about perception. And she knew how to command perception with volume, with force, with sheer presence. But beneath that surface of strength lay contradictions that shadowed her career. She positioned herself as a champion of accountability, yet often stood alongside the very figures accused of undermining it. She claimed to defend integrity, yet was dogged by allegations of political favoritism and opportunism. For every supporter who praised her firebrand spirit, there was another who saw in her a mirror of everything corrosive in modern politics, an instinct for outrage without the discipline of reflection. She built her career on outrage, one commentator once remarked, but outrage would soon betray her. That truth lingered like an omen, because outrage, while explosive and headline-grabbing, is also fragile. It burns hot, then burns out. It wins the moment, but not the future. And Bondi had staked everything on the belief that volume could substitute for substance, that domination of the conversation meant domination of the truth. Her style inside debates and interviews was legendary, though not always for the reasons she might have hoped. She had a habit of interrupting opponents mid-sentence, of cutting across their words with dismissive hand waves or sharp sighs. In courtrooms and on camera, she projected certainty, an unwavering conviction that she was right, and that anyone challenging her was not simply mistaken, but undeserving of being heard at all. That arrogance was not accidental, it was strategy. By speaking over her adversaries, Bondi framed herself as the authority, the one dictating the terms. She believed that if she could throw an opponent off balance, the spectacle alone would tilt the scales in her favor. Many times it worked. Viewers walked away not remembering the details of her arguments, but the impression of her dominance. Yet what had once been her greatest weapon was slowly morphing into her Achilles heel, because dominance achieved through dismissal is brittle. It cracks when met with composure. It falters when arrogance is exposed for what it is, an attempt to cover insecurity. Bondi had thrived in arenas where interruption went unchallenged, where opponents either yielded or snapped back with equal fury, lowering themselves into the same pit of noise. What she had not often faced was someone like Jasmine Crockett, someone who refused to wrestle in the mud, who answered fury with poise, who let silence itself become an indictment. In that chamber, Bondi's old habits rose to the surface like muscle memory. The dismissive tone, the sharp interruptions, the performance of dominance, these were her tools, her comfort zone. She believed they would carry her through as they always had. But what she could not see was that the country had grown weary of such theater. Audiences no longer mistook shouting for strength. They were beginning to crave something else: calm clarity, steady truth, dignity that did not demand attention but commanded it. That blindness, the inability to recognize that her very style was turning into a liability, was Bondi's unraveling. She entered the confrontation certain that her voice would carry the night. She did not realize that in trying to silence another, she would expose herself most of all. Pam Bondi had power, yes. She had name recognition, media savvy, and a history of legal battles fought in the glare of national headlines. But she also had arrogance, the kind that confuses dominance with respect. And arrogance, once cracked, collapses fast. She had built herself into the villain without ever admitting it, convinced that her fire could not be extinguished. Yet on that night, facing a woman who embodied a different kind of strength, Bondi's fire was about to consume itself. Long before Jasmine Crockett's name began trending on social media, long before television cameras captured her poised defiance in the face of a shouted command, she was a young woman navigating the hard realities of a country that often tells people like her to shrink, to stay silent, to accept less. But silence was never her destiny. Crockett's story begins far from the marble chambers and flashing cameras of Washington. She was raised with the grit of someone who had to fight for space in rooms where her voice wasn't always invited. Growing up, she learned early that justice wasn't something handed down from the top. It was something ordinary people had to demand, piece by piece, case by case, truth by truth. That lesson carried her into law school, where she chose not the easy path of corporate comfort, but the grueling work of defending those who couldn't afford the high-priced advocates of power. She took on clients whose names would never make headlines: single mothers facing eviction, young men caught in a justice system tilted against them, immigrants terrified of deportation. Her office was often more crowded than her paycheck was generous, but for Crockett, the measure of success was never wealth. It was the relief in a client's eyes when they realized someone finally was willing to stand beside them. Those years built her reputation not as a firebrand chasing attention, but as a servant of justice who met people where they were. And yet, for all her legal acumen, what people remembered most was not her arguments but her composure. She didn't grandstand in court. She didn't need to. Her calm confidence unnerved prosecutors who relied on intimidation. She had mastered a rare skill, speaking so clearly, so firmly, that even silence bent around her words. When she stepped into politics, it wasn't as a polished insider or a member of an old guard. She was an outsider, an underdog. Running for office meant knocking on doors that weren't always opened, facing questions about whether someone like her could ever fit in the halls of power. But Crockett carried the same resilience that had carried her clients. She believed that leadership didn't come from pedigree or privilege. It came from service, from the hard-earned trust of people who saw her show up again and again when no one else would. Her victories were never easy. She lost before she won. She was doubted before she was celebrated. And each time she faced resistance, she responded not with bitterness, but with persistence. It was that resilience that drew people to her, that made her more than just another name on a ballot. She was proof that you could come from outside the establishment and still bend it toward justice. And here lay the heart of Jasmine Crockett's power. Her calm was not the absence of fire. It was fire under control, disciplined, directed, wielded with precision. Where others screamed to prove their strength, Crockett understood that true strength did not require theatrics. It required clarity, discipline, and the courage to remain steady when every instinct told you to lash out. Her composure wasn't weakness, it was mastery. It was the discipline of someone who had weathered too many storms to be shaken by another gust of wind. It was the confidence of a lawyer who had sat across from prosecutors determined to crush her clients, and still found a way to carve out justice. It was the steadiness of a woman who had heard "you don't belong here" more times than she could count, and yet kept showing up, undeterred, unbroken. So when Pam Bondi hurled her voice across that chamber, when the word "stop" echoed like a gavel of attempted dominance, Crockett did not flinch. She didn't rise from her seat in anger. She didn't match volume with volume. She stood not physically, but morally, spiritually, emotionally. Her very presence became its own act of defiance, a reminder that dignity itself can be louder than rage. The contrast could not have been clearer. Bondi's power was rooted in noise, in the fleeting dominance of a moment. Crockett's power was rooted in something deeper, the slow, unyielding accumulation of battles fought on behalf of the voiceless, the quiet dignity of a woman who had nothing left to prove. This was the kind of strength that doesn't shout, it stands. And as millions prepared to watch the next chapter of this clash unfold, few could grasp how that discipline, forged in years of struggle and service, was about to define not only the night, but the very narrative of what leadership looks like in America. The chamber buzzed with the nervous electricity of an audience that sensed the confrontation wasn't over. Pam Bondi's voice had already pierced the air once, but her frustration didn't cool. It simmered hotter with every second that passed. She leaned forward, chin high, eyes narrowing into sharp lines of disdain. Her voice, at first measured, began to climb in pitch and volume, like a storm rolling closer. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, did not shift. Her back remained straight, her hands folded neatly before her, her breathing even. She responded in the same steady tone that had guided her through countless courtrooms, a cadence so clear it forced listeners to lean in rather than recoil. For Crockett, there was no need to match fire with fire. Her calm was its own rebuke. Bondi bristled at that composure. Each time Crockett answered, it seemed to inflame her further, as if Crockett's refusal to take the bait was more insulting than any words themselves. She cut in again and again, raising her voice, pushing her body across the table, gesturing wildly with her hands. Her interruptions came sharp and jagged, leaving no room for courtesy. "You're twisting the facts," Bondi barked. Crockett waited for her to finish, then answered in that same even tone, eyes steady, never wavering. "The record speaks for itself." The contrast was unmistakable. Bondi's shoulders heaved as she spoke, her frustration visible in every movement, the tightening of her jaw, the tapping of her manicured nails against the wood. Crockett, by contrast, was stillness personified. She didn't fidget, didn't raise her voice, didn't let her pulse quicken. Her composure became more pronounced with every eruption from Bondi. Around them, the audience shifted uneasily. Murmurs rippled through the rows like a current. Some leaned forward with fascination. Others glanced at each other with raised brows, silently wondering how far this would go. The sound of chairs creaking, pens tapping nervously against notepads, whispered side comments, all of it layered into the rising sense that something combustible was building in the room. Reporters in the back clutched their phones tighter, thumbs ready to fire off updates before the moment even ended. Everyone could feel the viral potential brewing, though none could predict exactly when it would explode. Bondi's face flushed deeper as Crockett's calm replies landed without strain. It was the kind of response that doesn't fuel the fire but smothers it, forcing the aggressor into more desperate displays. Bondi grew louder, her voice nearly breaking into a shout, as if sheer decibels could drown out reason. Crockett's words, by comparison, came measured, her sentences deliberate. She spoke with the patience of someone who knew the weight of silence, who understood that every pause could carry more force than any outburst. And with each contrast, the power dynamics in the room shifted ever so slightly. The murmurs grew louder. A staffer in the corner tried to suppress a laugh when Bondi, cutting in mid-sentence yet again, stumbled over her own words. A camera flash went off, catching Bondi mid-gesture, her hand frozen in the air, mouth twisted with indignation. In that snapshot alone, the imbalance was plain. One woman unraveling, the other unmoved. Bondi's frustration was no longer just audible. It was visible in every line of her body. Crockett's refusal to break rattled her, and she leaned harder into her old habit, dominance through interruption. But dominance without control is a dangerous game. Each outburst chipped away at her authority, each raised decibel leaving the audience less impressed and more unsettled. The chamber had become a stage, every listener an audience member witnessing a duel of styles, rage versus restraint, arrogance versus discipline. The tension was not just in the air, it was pressing against the walls, demanding release. And then the breaking point arrived. "Stop talking." The words erupted from Pam Bondi like a cannon blast, rattling against the marble walls of the chamber. It wasn't a plea for order. It wasn't even a demand for clarity. It was raw command, barked with the arrogance of someone who believed the mere act of raising her voice could silence truth itself. For a split second, time froze. The chamber held its breath. Pens hovered in midair, cameras locked their focus, and the sound of Bondi's fury reverberated into a silence so heavy it felt almost physical. You could feel the ripple pass through the audience. Gasps, stiffened shoulders, the wide eyes of people who had just witnessed a line being crossed. And there, at the center of it all, sat Jasmine Crockett. She did not shrink. She did not recoil. She did not meet volume with volume. Instead, she lifted her chin, straightened her posture, and waited. The silence became her ally. Every heartbeat stretched the moment longer, making Bondi's outburst echo all the louder in contrast to Crockett's calm. Finally, Crockett spoke. Her voice was low, steady, precise, each word a scalpel cutting through the chaos. "You may yell, but you don't get to rewrite the facts, and you certainly don't get to silence me." The chamber gasped again, this time not in shock but in awe. The words landed with the force of a gavel striking oak. It wasn't the volume that made them powerful. It was their clarity, their restraint, the undeniable authority of a woman who refused to be diminished. Bondi blinked as though trying to process what had just happened. For years, she had relied on bluster to dominate her opponents. Shouting was her weapon. But here, against Crockett's composure, her weapon misfired. The louder she grew, the weaker she seemed. Crockett continued, her cadence unbroken, her tone even. "This chamber was built for debate, not for silencing. And I will keep speaking because the people who sent me here deserve a voice, even when it makes others uncomfortable." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the emptiness of a room waiting for the next sound. It was the stunned quiet of people realizing they had just witnessed a turning point. Even Bondi's supporters shifted in their seats, uneasy at the imbalance suddenly laid bare. Bondi tried to recover, fumbling for words. She gestured with her hands, her face flushed, her breath quickening. "That's not what I meant," she stammered, her volume faltering now, not rising. The woman who had once commanded headlines with her fiery soundbites now seemed cornered, her armor cracking under the weight of her own tactics. Crockett, however, did not pile on. She didn't need to. Her reply had already done its work. She simply leaned back, eyes steady, hands folded again as though she had closed the case. And in many ways she had. A beat of silence, then another. The cameras zoomed in closer, the audience frozen, the moment stretching long enough to burn itself into memory. It was as if the room collectively understood. History had just been etched. And then the whispers began. Reporters at the back of the room scrambled for their phones, their fingers flying. Staffers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling behind their hands. A few muffled chuckles escaped the crowd, not at Crockett, but at Bondi's unraveling. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Twitter feeds lit up. Hashtags erupted across timelines. Memes were born in real time, capturing Crockett's steady gaze juxtaposed against Bondi's red-faced shout. One post read, "This is what composure looks like. Crockett 1, Bondi 0. Another simply said, "Stop talking. Nah, keep talking, Jasmine." Cable networks replayed the moment on loop, dissecting it frame by frame. Analysts spoke of tone versus truth, of the danger of arrogance meeting calm discipline. On late-night shows, comedians reenacted the exchange, exaggerating Bondi's shrill command only to fall silent as they mimicked Crockett's devastatingly calm reply. But even in the frenzy of coverage, the essence remained. Crockett hadn't just survived an attack, she had defined the night. She had flipped the dynamic so thoroughly that what was meant to diminish her had instead elevated her. Bondi, meanwhile, could not escape the image that now followed her, a once commanding figure visibly flustered, overpowered not by noise but by silence. She had entered the chamber certain she would control the narrative, and left as the cautionary tale of how arrogance collapses when faced with dignity. And Crockett, her rise was not measured in volume or theatrics, but in the ripple of recognition spreading across America. Viewers saw themselves in her. They saw their own moments of being told to sit down, to stop talking, to yield. And they saw, in Crockett's measured defiance, the vindication they had long craved. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a parable. It was the story of how calm can conquer chaos, how truth can outlast shouting, how dignity can silence arrogance without raising its voice. The clip would live far beyond the chamber, replayed not only as a political moment but as a cultural one, a rallying cry for those who had been dismissed, interrupted, silenced. Crockett had given them more than a defense. She had given them proof. Silence imposed by force is fragile, but silence chosen in strength is unbreakable. The room eventually stirred again, the official proceedings resuming with a thin pretense of normalcy. But everyone inside knew normalcy had already been shattered. They had seen arrogance unravel. They had seen composure triumph. And somewhere deep inside, even Pam Bondi must have known it too. Because after the command, after the silence, after the reply heard around the country, there was no undoing it. The night now belonged to Jasmine Crockett. And as the buzz in the chamber turned into an online wildfire, one truth became undeniable. The calm reply that Bondi had tried to silence had instead echoed louder than she could have ever imagined. What came next would send shockwaves far beyond that room. The clip didn't just go viral, it detonated across the internet like a political thunderclap. Within an hour, hashtags blazed through Twitter. Keep talking Jasmine, calm over chaos, Bondi meltdown. TikTok stitched Crockett's reply into endless edits, some with cinematic music swelling beneath her words, others freezing on the moment Bondi barked, "Stop talking," before cutting to Crockett's calm, devastating reply. Instagram feeds filled with screenshots of Crockett's poised expression, captions praising the courage of a woman who refused to be drowned out. Memes sprang up overnight. One showed Bondi's red-faced shout alongside a caption, "When you lose the argument at volume 100." Another juxtaposed Crockett's steady gaze with the words, "Strength doesn't shout, it stands." On YouTube, political remix artists looped the exchange into beats. The words "stop talking" chopped into stuttering samples, only to be flattened by Crockett's cool, measured retort. Even late-night comedians joined in. Monologues opened with mock recreations of Bondi yelling, only for the host to stop mid-joke and lower their voice, whispering Crockett's reply as though it carried more weight than any punchline. But beyond the humor, something deeper resonated. Ordinary citizens flooded comment sections with stories of their own, the time they'd been interrupted in classrooms, boardrooms, or family tables. They saw themselves in Crockett's stillness, her refusal to match rage with rage. One viral Facebook post read, "For every time I was told to be quiet, Jasmine Crockett just spoke for me." On Reddit, a thread of thousands of comments dissected not only the debate but the symbolism. A black woman standing unflinching against the shrill authority of a system too used to silencing her. The validation poured in. Teachers shared clips with their students, describing Crockett as a model of composure. Activists replayed it at rallies, proof that calm conviction could puncture bluster. Parents wrote that their children asked to rewatch the moment, wanting to hear again how someone could answer rage without losing their center. For millions, Crockett had given voice to a quiet power they long believed was overlooked. Meanwhile, the media spun in all directions. Some conservative outlets scrambled to defend Bondi, insisting her outburst had been taken out of context, that Crockett had provoked her. But the replay betrayed them. The evidence was undeniable. Neutral commentators framed the clash as a turning point. Tone versus truth, one analyst declared on CNN, replaying the footage beside a split screen of polls showing surging admiration for Crockett. MSNBC anchors went further, framing it as a metaphor for the nation's divide, outrage politics colliding with disciplined resilience. And the ripple effect didn't stop at pundits. Politicians themselves began referencing the exchange. Senators slipped Crockett's words into floor speeches, praising her composure. Candidates on the campaign trail quoted her line, "You may yell, but you don't get to rewrite the facts," as if it were scripture. The phrase appeared on signs at protests, painted across cardboard in thick black marker. Some whispered that it could even become a defining slogan for a movement larger than Crockett herself. Even those who weren't fans of her politics had to concede the power of the moment. Editorials across the spectrum acknowledged it. She hadn't just survived an outburst, she had flipped the balance of power. Crockett proved that restraint can be revolutionary, one columnist wrote. Another declared, Pam Bondi showed the politics of the past. Jasmine Crockett showed the politics of the future. The chamber incident was no longer just a clip. It was a cultural mirror. It forced people to ask which side of the exchange they wanted to embody. The shout that demanded silence or the calm reply that reshaped the narrative. And in living rooms, classrooms, and coffee shops, that question became a quiet litmus test for identity itself. Bondi, meanwhile, could not escape. Every interview request carried the shadow of the clip. Every public appearance threatened new heckles from crowds mimicking her shout. For someone who had long thrived on commanding attention, the kind of attention she now drew was far less flattering. Crockett, on the other hand, carried herself with the same calm that had defined the night. She did not gloat, she did not gash the wound deeper. Instead, she stayed on message, letting the country decide what it had seen. And the country, it seemed, had made its choice. But amid the laughter, the hashtags, the soaring praise, something else lingered, something weightier. The explosion of memes and headlines was only the surface. Beneath it, in the deeper currents of public consciousness, the clash had awakened a larger hunger. Because the world wasn't just laughing at Bondi or cheering for Crockett. It was asking, almost subconsciously, if calm could triumph here, what else might it transform? And that question was only beginning to take shape. But beyond the noise, something deeper was taking shape. In a political culture addicted to volume, the lesson of that night was unmistakable. Noise does not equal strength. Pam Bondi shouted until her face flushed, but her words dissolved into the air like smoke. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, proved that composure is not weakness. It is strategy, it is courage, it is power. In a world that rewards arrogance and spectacle, calm truth still wins. That chamber moment exposed a truth bigger than any single debate. Too often, Americans have been told that the loudest voice must be the strongest, that to dominate is to prevail. But Crockett showed the opposite. Her reply wasn't merely about defending herself. It was about modeling a different way of holding ground. She didn't match Bondi's chaos. She transcended it. And that transcendence resonated far beyond politics. Teachers replayed the clip in classrooms, not to talk about partisanship, but to illustrate dignity. Community leaders used it to remind young people that resilience isn't about shouting the longest. It's about knowing when silence can cut deeper than noise. In homes across the country, parents told their children, "See this? This is how you win without raising your voice." The symbolism couldn't have been clearer. Bondi embodied a politics of arrogance, quick to silence, quick to dismiss, always convinced volume could substitute for vision. Crockett embodied the politics of service, anchored in respect, rooted in justice, unmoved by intimidation. Their clash became more than a viral skirmish. It became a parable for the crossroads America finds itself in. Because at its heart, this wasn't just Crockett versus Bondi. It was dignity versus arrogance, patience versus bluster, the future versus the past. And for millions watching, the moral clarity of that divide felt liberating. Crockett's words carried an aftershock because they weren't just clever, they were true. They exposed the emptiness of Bondi's performance without sinking into insult. They proved that when someone tries to drown you out, the most devastating answer isn't to shout back, it's to remain unshaken. And that is why her reply became more than a viral clip. It became a cultural moment of hope. It reminded people that justice doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, it arrives in the quiet force of someone refusing to be silenced. It reminded immigrants, workers, students, and everyday citizens that dignity is its own form of resistance. Even now, the lesson echoes: composure can outlast chaos, truth can outshine noise, service can outlive arrogance. Crockett didn't just respond to Bondi, she reframed the meaning of power in that room. And in doing so, she offered a vision of leadership grounded not in intimidation, but in integrity. The chamber may have erupted with gasps, memes, and hashtags, but the deeper takeaway was simpler. Calm isn't passive, it's revolutionary. And in that revolutionary calm, people found a piece of themselves, a reminder of who they could be when the world tells them to sit down, be quiet, or stop talking. That is why the moment endures. Not because one woman yelled, but because another chose not to. And in choosing dignity over arrogance, Jasmine Crockett turned a clash into a cultural milestone, a fleeting exchange into a timeless reminder. The reminder that even in the loudest rooms, calm truth still wins. It began with one voice shouting, "Stop talking," a command meant to silence, to dominate, to erase. But it ended with another voice, calm and unwavering, cutting through the noise and reminding the nation that dignity is louder than arrogance, and truth is stronger than rage. Jasmine Crockett's reply didn't just go viral because it was clever. It went viral because it carried something deeper: the values of respect, justice, and unshakable composure. The clip was shared millions of times, replayed in classrooms, dissected on news panels, and celebrated across social media. But as powerful as that moment was, its meaning cannot stay confined to headlines and hashtags. Because what Crockett showed us in that chamber is not just a viral highlight, it is a blueprint for how we meet the storms in our own lives. When we are shouted down, we can choose to rise above. When arrogance tries to silence us, we can stand in calm defiance. When division screams for attention, we can answer with unity and resolve. That is why this story matters. Because the clip went viral, but the values behind it must go even further. If you believe that dignity must triumph over chaos, if you believe composure is stronger than cruelty, then let this moment not just inspire you but move you. Share this video. Subscribe to this channel. Add your voice to a community that chooses justice over noise, respect over ridicule, service over spectacle. Together, we can amplify not just one calm reply in a heated chamber, but an entire movement that believes America is strongest when it listens, when it respects, when it stands tall without shouting. Because in the end, calm truth still wins.